If we want to have a society that's rooted in self-government, we need to accept there are going to be mechanisms of power that are not always democratic. The attachment to pure democracy in some of these contexts just misses the point of how our institutions and systems are coming under pressure.
This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. Jason, there are many thoughtful, well-intentioned people who are concerned about the erosion of democratic norms in America. They fear that we are sliding towards authoritarianism, that when you're looking at younger Americans, for example, they no longer have the same civic convictions of earlier generations. There are a lot of people who believe that when they look at partisans on the other side of the political divide, they see people who do not believe in the basic rules of the game that have structured American democracy in the past. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I think that's entirely understandable and certainly true to an extent that lots of our structures are coming under strain. I mean, people are questioning the Supreme Court's legitimacy. We had somebody try to overturn an election. There's all sorts of very intense, the president is going to states saying that they're imposing Jim Crow. So I do think, we are at a time of heightened tension about some of these institutions. I do think a lot of the sort of academic and mainstream media discourse misses the mark on this because it assumes, a person is either pro-democracy or anti-democracy. And it's the anti-democracy people who are bad and who need to be shut out of the political process or have their representatives shut out of the political process. And I think that, a growing amount of research just shows that that's not the case. It's not that a person supports democracy or opposes it. Americans are really wedded to the idea of democracy. And, in fact, they're so wedded to the idea of democracy that when it looks like the other side is violating some democratic principle, whether it's, by an executive order or a counter-majoritarian decision by a court, or changing the rules in an election, this is so offensive that it leads to actions in sort of quasi self-defense. Making sure that the democratic process isn't undermined by perhaps overcompensating in the other direction. And so I think everyone is actually really attached to this idea of self-government. And I think what appear to be problems of democracy really arise out of that conviction and that attachment. They don't come from a notion that there should be autocracy or there should be some other form of government.
So what you're saying is that this strong attachment to the idea of democratic self-rule actually is contributing to democratic backsliding by actually making it seem acceptable to exclude your political opponents from the process? Right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if your political opponents are a threat to the democratic process, and there is just some research that people overestimate the extent to which the other side wants to violate various democratic norms. I mean, they think it's higher than their side's willingness to do so. But precisely because they think that the other side is willing to do that, I think that that justifies anti-democratic behavior. I think most anti-democratic behavior that we see, insofar as it's possible to define such a thing, because people have different definitions, but it's justified in the name of some version of democracy. If the president, is seizing new powers from Congress, that's because a majority of people want it, and the president is being obstructed, and the will of the people is being obstructed, and the president is their true representative, and that's why he gets to do it. So there are other examples like that. So I think the threat to democracy arises.
And you hear arguments along those lines from voices on the right or left, depending on who is in the executive branch.
Totally. Totally. And who is in the executive branch and who has a majority on the Supreme Court, and what was the election outcome. But one argument that I've sort of tried to make in a subtle way is if we want to have a society that's rooted in self-government, we need to accept that there are going to be mechanisms of power that are not always democratic. I mean, one of my favorite examples is the reform of the Electoral Count Act after January 6th. There was this effort to overturn the election. And the response of Congress has been basically to give more power to adjudicate elections to courts instead of to Congress. If it was a pure democracy, why can't the people's elected representatives decide whether or not to certify the election? But in part of the solution has been to take that out of the democratic process, because that's a decision what the democratic process isn't necessarily suited to do. So anyway, so I think that the attachment to pure democracy in some of these contexts just misses the point of how our institutions and systems are coming under pressure.
Perhaps part of the challenge is that when we talk about liberal democratic norms and institutions, oftentimes people of different ideological persuasions have a different conception of what exactly that means. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on, for example, when you're looking at progressives, progressive champions of democracy, how is it that they think a democracy ought to work? And then when you're looking at folks on the political right, many of whom are not necessarily comfortable with the language of democracy per se. You hear a lot of grassroots conservatives, for example, say that America is a republic, not a democracy. It seems that there is a different kind of underlying conception about how the American constitutional order ought to work. So tell us a little bit about that progressive conception and that conservative conception in broad strokes about what the American regime ought to look like.
Yeah. I think the progressive conception we have seen they both have tensions in them. I think the progressive conception is this attachment to majoritarianism. You see that often. Who won the popular vote? The Senate is undemocratic. Supreme Court justices were confirmed by states with senators that don't represent a majority of the country. The Supreme Court is counter-majoritarian. So there's this suspicion of counter-majoritarian institutions combined with a sort of deference to expertise as it manifests in sort of elite institutions and administrative agencies. So you have this idea that, expert knowledge should determine the answer to problems. That's not itself a majoritarian idea. To the contrary, expert knowledge is something that's very rarefied and only a minority of people possess it in a certain field. But you often see an assumption, I think, from progressives that if experts are saying something, if people are going against experts, that's somehow suspect. So I'd say there's this interesting marriage of sort of majoritarianism, but also a comfort with administrative agencies and elite institutions sort of setting the boundaries for debate, for example, on misinformation, on what kind of speech is harmful and what kind of speech is acceptable. But I would say overall majoritarianism. I mean, since the left for a long time has been suspicious of forms of power that are not majoritarianism, because the idea is if the people's true expression, unobstructed by misinformation, unobstructed by counter-majoritarian institutions, unobstructed by, dark money, that majority expression of the people would ultimately be sort of progressive and solidaristic and consistent with progressive goals. So, but you have also this support for expertise as a mediating factor.
That is so fascinating because you're right. There is a really interesting tension there when you mention misinformation, which we can talk about at greater length later on. But it is this idea that there is some pure expression of the majority will that is somehow being manipulated, that is somehow being shaped by these shadowy forces. And so in some cases, majority opinion can't really be trusted because of these malefactors of great wealth. But in other cases, it can. And that seems a bit hard to reconcile, but that is really fascinating. Just this kind of combination of elitist technocracy and majoritarian sentiment.
Yeah, totally. I mean, misinformation is one of my favorite examples of sort of how debates over democracy, how democracy doesn't even give a language to resolve it. Because if one element of democracy is freedom of speech and the free discovery of ideas, conservatives take the whole misinformation thing to be about censorship and to be anti-democratic, and progressives take it to be the only way democracy can work. How can democracy work if people don't have good information? That's a false verdict on what their view is if they don't have the right information. So that's something that, one example of the way that I think the democracy debate has gone off the rails, in that if you supposedly support democracy, you want to crack down on misinformation, but it could really go either way. And so on the conservative side, how they conceive of the American regime, as you say, I think there's long been more of a comfort with counter-majoritarian institutions. Of course, all these things are dynamic. I mean, Republicans now and conservatives now are more comfortable with judicial power and advocating intellectual ideas of more judicial engagement and a muscular judicial approach to enforcing the Constitution, as opposed to what they would previously see as an imperial judiciary that was undemocratic. So these things do change, but I would say conservatism, going back to Edmund Burke, has not seen, quote, the people as inherently virtuous, and somehow that if the true will of the people could be discovered, that would be genuine and authentic in some way. I suppose there's always been conservative populism that takes that view, but I think going back to the Federalists, there's more comfort, with elite forms of power, and power being institutionalized in certain ways, so that it's separated, and there's different sources of it, whether it's the states, different parts of the government, they're all performing different roles, and so it can only, there's certain ways that it can be wielded. One branch can do X, one branch can do Y, one branch can do Z. Or I think the progressives take more of a sort of aggregate approach. This is what government is going to serve the people as a whole, and are less concerned with dividing it up in particular ways, with the types of power that is used. The outcomes are more important.
And among some progressive intellectuals, I think it's not unreasonable to say that there is skepticism about the kind of structure of government under the Constitution, the division of powers and what have you. There's a view that, well, this is something we have to live with, but in an ideal world, we would have a parliamentary democracy, say, something along those lines. Whereas when you're looking at conservatives, it does seem, and one hesitates to make generalities, here, but it does seem as though there is more comfort with, for example, limits on the franchise. If you look at, for example, the decision to deny ex-offenders the right to vote, or recently Vivek Ramaswamy, the Republican presidential candidate, floated the idea of stripping younger Americans of citizenship unless they, for example, serve in the military. It's an idea that is not necessarily going to become the conservative consensus, but it is an idea that seems in tune with this idea that citizenship, that voting rights can be understood as a privilege rather than as something that everyone is automatically entitled to.
And I think we're going to see more of that debate. I mean, there's a controversy now of whether felons have a Second Amendment right to bear arms, and so some progressives are aghast that conservatives would say, felon disenfranchisement is okay, but felon disarming felons is not necessarily okay under the Second Amendment. But you're right. I think the view of voting as there's probably less weight in conservatism and conservative thought about democracy on I don't know if I want to say that. I think for everybody, elections are like the cornerstone of democracy in some sense, because both because they tell you who's gonna be in the government, and because they're like a ritual where we all sort of affirm our faith in democracy, and it's sort of a legitimating process. But I think you're right. The conservatives are more comfortable with that. Progressives would argue they're comfortable with it for people who they don't think are going to vote for them. But I think there's definitely important differences.
Yeah, it is really interesting because this has become a huge central battleground of the democracy wars when you're looking at voting, how voting practices are governed, kind of how they work differently from state to state, county to county. And it does seem as though when you're looking at the progressive vanguard, there are a lot of people who believe that the administration of elections should be federalized and that it should be as permissive as possible. You have universal automatic registration as one rallying cry, and then you also have mail-in balloting, ballot harvesting, and what have you. It really does seem as though, particularly in recent years, there's this belief on the progressive left that any inconvenience in casting a ballot is something that represents a kind of perversion of democracy. Whereas among conservatives, there is a great deal of anxiety about this kind of permissiveness, partly out of concern about voter fraud, but also it seems that there is at least an implicit concern that we actually shouldn't make this as easy as possible, that voting is a kind of civic responsibility, and that there is something good and reasonable to expect everyone to vote, let's say on a particular day as a kind of shared civic ritual, even if that does happen to be moderately inconvenient. I kind of wonder what you think about that and what that tells us about the difference between right and left.
Yeah, no, I think, to me, one of the main reasons to be concerned about mail-in balloting is because if you don't have the election on the same day, if you go back, there's a good book by Edmund Morgan that I consult, the historian that I consult on a lot of these things, that sort of early Anglo-American elections, like election day was like a big party, and it was, when consent was transferred from the people to their elected representatives, and people saw each other doing it and sort of took part in it together. And one reason I don't like, indefinite periods of mail-in voting is because you lose that legitimating piece of it for at some level. It's more attenuated. You don't, it's not a day where everyone goes to the polls. I think, also to the point of, easy or hard to vote. I think it goes back to what we said about progressives. If the true will of the people could be divined, that would be truly authentic in some way. And I think conservatives think, well, I think some conservatives at least think, it might not be the worst thing if people have to think a little bit about who they're going to vote for and register in time and do the rest of this, because that shows that there was that is sort of a process that will yield better decisions, and that it's not necessarily getting the most people to give their point of view and weigh those preferences together, but the process by which those decisions came about, and that explains why there's registration deadlines and various just basic requirements still within universal franchise. But I think that that's right, and it gets to and it fundamentally probably gets to the conservatives, the age-old conservative sense of more pessimistic view of human nature.
One of the ironies here is that for a very long time, one could reasonably surmise that lower propensity voters, or at least it was a commonplace belief, that lower propensity voters were more likely to vote for Democratic candidates and higher propensity voters were more likely to vote for Republican candidates. It does seem, with the march of education polarization, that this may have changed, and that actually there are a heck of a lot of low propensity voters who may well be Republicans now, and upper middle income, educated Democratic voters who are among the highest propensity voters. And yet still, it does seem as though conservatives, it's almost as though this is not an argument from self-interest. Maybe that's a matter of people not catching up to these kind of shifts in the coalition. But it actually seems like a sincere ideological conviction that, even if a given policy is going to maybe give you an edge electorally, it seems that there are kind of principled reasons at work, both for democracy advocates, call it advocates on the right and left. That's something that seems really interesting too. It really does seem like these are not just kind of cynical moves.
Yes, no, that's a good point. And I would say the other thing is, depending on your view of voting, democracy can turn into sort of a mobilization contest versus a persuasion contest. And I think I think probably progressives are more comfortable with this idea of a contest over mobilization, over bringing people out to the polls. And depending on how you structure voting, structure election rules, you can get more of one or more of the other. And I would say also that there is also this view, probably, this kind of goes back to misinformation among progressives, that if people are not, that being, well, let me put it this way. I think less informed voters are really important to the transfer of power and to democracy. If the only people voting were the most polarized and knowledgeable people who are the most informed about what's going on, they're going to really care about who wins the election. It's like, if it's just the party faithful voting, it's important that you have some people voting for a candidate that if they lose, it's kind of okay. It lowers the stakes a little bit. So I think, I think it's not always the case that having the most informed and pristinely, informed voters is always is necessarily an unmitigated benefit.
Well, that's interesting. Let's tease that out a bit. So one argument is that actually low voter turnout is a sign about a kind of healthy political climate, because people don't feel all that exercised about the outcome. That's one view. Although I guess in that world, it is the most ideologically energized folks who do turn out. Another view is that actually high turnout. This is an important civic ritual, but it does seem that when turnout is voluntary, when voting is voluntary, that it really is all a mobilization game. And when we talk about democracy panic, it really does seem as though you have to turn every election into a contest over existential threats. It really has to be a matter of your rights are going to be stripped away from you, or we're all going to be vaporized in a nuclear war if the other guy wins. And I wonder how you think about that. One of your colleagues, E.J. Dionne, recently co-authored a book arguing for universal civic duty voting, a practice that's used in Australia and a handful of other democracies, where the idea is that everyone is expected to vote. And if you don't vote, you're subject to a fine. And it does seem as though that actually does shape civic discourse in significant ways.
Yeah, I haven't thought closely about these kinds of requirements. I think, like you said, I don't know to what extent some of these debates are like residual, Republican sense that this X or Y policy would hurt them, and that if they figured out that it actually might not hurt them, that it would change the view. But going on the assumption that there's real ideological reasons there for these stances, I think what you said is absolutely right. Negative partisanship, or the idea that if you don't vote, all your rights are going to be stripped away. Which, by the way, is what I am kind of arguing is the main challenge to our democracy, because that kind of thinking, lets people give themselves permission for all sorts of things. I mean, if you lose that election, you're never going to take power again. You're surrendering your rights and basically your democracy to the other party. That is precisely what gives everyone permission to violate some of these norms. And I think that negative partisanship goes along pretty well with the mobilization model of voting. And I think, and once again, I'm not a fan of mail-in voting, because I think that is encouraged by this idea of that you can vote on your own timeline for weeks ahead of time. That really encourages this mobilization approach.
I wonder, what is it that initially sparked your interest in these debates over democracy and constitutionalism?
That's a good question. I mean, it's funny. When I was first getting interested in politics and reading, Reihan Salam blog and articles in college and everything, these were not sort of on the radar to the same extent. I mean, we were more arguing about policy and it seems like our politics has reverted to, these fundamental questions, which, makes full employment for journalists like me, but it makes politics, we're at one of those periods where we're really debating fundamental structures and first principles, and not tweaks to the social welfare system and so on. Maybe we should be. Maybe that would probably show that our politics was healthier. But I think it's been a change just in my career, and that's what's made it feel kind of urgent.
It also seems as though there's been a kind of moral revolution. This relates to debates over race and racism and the role of racism in American history, something that you have studied very closely and thoughtfully. And I wonder how you think about that, how, over the last decade or so, this renewal of the idea that the U.S. Constitution is a slaveholder's constitution and that these institutions are therefore illegitimate, how that has shaped the intellectual playing field.
Yeah. And I think, I'm kind of like a realist about history. Like I really like these, Walter McDougall's History of the United States. He's a professor at Penn. Like, I don't think I ever romanticized the past history of the United States. So nor am I So I don't think, but I just think, these debates are at some level, where does our Constitution is our Constitution at some level, these concepts, the higher law is ultimately based on some sort of fiction. I mean, in this case, it was ratified by a few tens of thousands of people in 13 states a long time ago. We consider it the deliberate will of the people because, it is, insofar as it hasn't been amended, it isn't, but it requires some, leaps of imagination to understand why people accept it. And so, I think insofar as people want to attack that to try to delegitimate it, I guess I'm a conservative because I think legitimacy is a total mystery. Why people accept something. To some extent, it has to do with stories and myths and civic education, but institutions sort of earn legitimacy over time. And if people want to, go back and they can undermine everything. I mean, human history is messy. I wrote a column about North Carolina's Supreme Court, which has just changed from a Democratic to a Republican majority, but it reversed ballot measures that the voters of North Carolina had passed, both over voter ID and over the tax rate, because it said the legislature that put them on the ballot was gerrymandered. So it's okay, well, was the legislature gerrymandered that, passed the Sherman antitrust laws? I mean, you just have the institutions that you live within. You can't just reverse them based on, after the fact arguments about their legitimacy. So I'm a conservative in that sense. We take what we have. This is what we're working with. So I've never, frankly, been that impressed. So I'm not so impressed by these arguments against the Constitution, but nor am I so scandalized by them. I just find them kind of irrelevant.
That is fascinating, Jason. Partly because I think of you as someone who is, a kind of clear-eyed defender of the democratic potential of our particular mix of institutions and the division of powers and what have you. My impression from your work is that you think that, look, this mixed economy, this mixed constitution basically works quite well. And I wonder, is that right? I mean, kind of, when you compare the U.S. constitutional order to, for example, the parliamentary democracies of Europe, I kind of wonder how you think we fare.
Yeah. Well, first, I think the core of it is the division of power, because I think fundamentally what you want is not necessarily, you want different sources of power. And the British system that we came from was, divided power between, the king, lords, and commons. It was sort of different classes of society. And that goes back a long way in Europe, that different classes are sort of represented in different ways in the government. That's not what we do. Robert Dahl in Democracy and Its Critics argued we've sort of replaced that with a separation of functions. So the president and Congress represent everyone, but they do different things. The point is that there's some legible way to divide what kind of power different people hold so that it can't become too concentrated. I think that's the core insight of the founding, and I think it's the right insight is to divide power. And I think our system, presidential systems are there have been arguments against presidential systems in Latin America, how they can be unstable. But I have to say, I mean, when I hear people talking about a parliamentary system in the United States, and they're comparing it to countries with 15 million people that are much more homogenous in Europe, this is clearly the United States could not have held together under one of these, under a Westminster system even, or under a proportional representation parliamentary system. These are, there's a tendency to reverse engineer. This is my ideal theory of government as a political scientist, but the United States is, my friend Walter Russell Mead says, it's the second most complicated country in the world after India. India may be more complicated, but it's such a complicated country, so you can't. So I don't think. Yes, I do think that the system that it uses to govern itself works quite well. And insofar as the attacks on some of the other systems are that our system is that it's anti-democratic, or it's less majoritarian. That often ends up when you scratch beneath the surface. That's not true. Justin Trudeau did not win his party did not win the most votes in Canada. The Conservative Party actually won more votes. Or, you look at a country like Israel, where it's very proportional to representation, but to limit the number of parties, you need to increase the threshold, how many votes they need to get into government. So that ends up with wasted votes. So I think our system is quite democratic, and more importantly, it works.
Interesting. I wonder, when you're looking at our constitutional order, there is a very influential line of argument that the separation of powers has been replaced by a separation of parties, and that this is actually quite dangerous. That the nature of the separation of powers is that you want Congress and congressional leaders to jealously guard the prerogatives of their institution, to guard it against encroachments from the executive branch, but that what we have instead is this situation in which the president is seen as the leader of his or her political party, and that there is this incredible deference, and that under conditions of cohabitation or divided government, that there is this intense friction that can often cause government to ground to a halt. That's not really this kind of instinct to protect the power of the institution, more than it is this desire to defeat the president at the next election, or the president's party, I should say. I wonder what you think about that. Is that separation of parties dynamic something that we can correct through institutional reform? Is it that bad? I'm curious.
Yeah, maybe I overstated how well our system works. I think that's true that we have. That's the key problem that everyone has identified. Phil Willick has a great book out about Congress, but I think the diminishment of Congress is the key problem, and the transition to policy making that's more based in the executive and then adjudicated in the judiciary. I think, you've seen Congress not guard its authorities in the way that you think it might, and Democrats are happy. For example, in the student loan debt cancellation, even though you actually had a bipartisan vote against that with Joe Manchin and I think John Tester joining the Democrats and the Republicans in the Senate, for example, against the Biden student loan cancellation. You have many Democrats in Congress happy for President Biden to be commandeering Congress's spending power, because without him doing that, they wouldn't deliver the policy outcome they wanted. So I think that's definitely a severe problem, but it's still the case, I think, that we do have a separation of powers. I mean, one reason in Israel why people are so upset about judicial reform is they're saying that's the only check on the elected government. The Netanyahu administration, can only be checked by the judiciary because it's a parliamentary system. So there's no separation. The prime minister is an extension of the parliament. We do have a separation there. The president is not a creature of Congress. He's not created or elected by Congress, and he does do different things. So it does create certain deformities, but it is, I think, doing its job of separating power and separating the functions of government into different institutions.
Do you believe there are any structural reforms that could be passed by Congress, constitutional amendments even, that could help put our system of government on a stronger footing, that could enhance the legitimacy of our system?
I think there could be experimentation. I mean, people like the idea of multi-member districts and proportional representation, and I'd love to see states experimenting with some of these things, because we sort of have the exact same single-member district, bicameral, with the exception of Nebraska, system in each state, and the Constitution says each state will guarantee a Republican form of government, but there ought to be more leeway than that, than having this one governor bicameral legislative system in the state. So I would be interested to see some experimentation in the structure of state governments before we make any adjustments to the federal government. Some problems with that include, the Voting Rights Act and other things may make multi-member districts or at-large districts subject to constitutional challenge. So some of this might need clearance from Congress. But yeah, I'd like to see sort of more state experimentation. Judge Jeffrey Sutton of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals has a book called 51 Imperfect Solutions, and he sort of talks about constitutionalism at the state level may be different from constitutionalism at the federal level. Maybe a state's guarantee of privacy means different than the Fourth Amendment at the federal level. So I do think we could have a more sort of vital constitutional and structural competition in the states. I think federally, we want to look at ways to try to make Congress work better. And I think, frankly, the Freedom Caucus in the Kevin McCarthy election has done some good things on the way to creating regular order in the House, meaning sort of a more rigorous committee process. But I think that is going to come from, then we could talk about campaign finance reforms and things like that might change the kinds of politicians who are elected.
Jason, I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about campaign finance regulation. There's a lively scholarly debate about how campaign finance regulation has shaped the playing field within Congress. One very common line of argument is that when you have this individual candidate-centered system of campaign finance, you weaken political parties and you create strong incentives for individual lawmakers to build their brand by, going on cable news, grandstanding about big issues, rather than engaging in the kind of patient, deliberative work of crafting legislation. I wonder, what your view is on the way that we approach campaign finance now.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that I've expressed sort of this skepticism of this idea that if only we had the right institutions in place, we could get the authentic will of the people represented, is that this was, I'd say, one of the ideas behind campaign finance reform that's been a failure. Which is that there's too many big donors. We want grassroots donors in our politics, and especially as that's merged with the internet and the rise of these sort of online fundraising machines, where a very small percentage of the electorate that's very mobilized. We were talking about how the role for mobilized people in the electorate, but also that you don't want them to be the only people determining your election outcomes. Can have huge difference on impact on candidate incentives. And it sounds more democratic if there's a lot of small dollar donations. Candidates love to brag about it, but it's not necessarily giving the incentives we want. There was a recent study even that found that the candidates that voted to object to certifying Arizona and Pennsylvania's electoral votes on January 6, 2021 tended to be, even after you control for ideology and time in Congress and other things, tended to be those candidates who had the smallest percentage of PAC contributions from corporations. It turns out corporations may not be democratic institutions, but they do have an interest in stability, and they do have an interest in predictability and the rule of law and things like that. And so, that's one example, I would say, where some of these efforts have been self-defeating of some of these that flow from the premise of greater democracy is always better. That I would say has been, and frankly, political scientists, to their credit, I mean, I'd say they've won the debate. I mean, it's pretty clear among political scientists that the effect that this has had. It may not have translated to the political system, but I think the political science work at this point is getting pretty clear on the corrosive impacts of that.
The Roberts Court has had a very busy term. And among many other things, they've made a number of decisions that have bearing on the democracy debate that you've been covering so closely. Can you talk to us a bit about your understanding of how the Roberts Court is approaching these issues, both at the state and federal levels?
Sure. I think, just to say, one example is the student loan decision, because I thought that was interesting, because in Justice Elena Kagan's dissent on it, she sort of articulated this very Wilsonian, this sort of view that I described that's expert-driven. She said, look, administrative agencies have more expertise. Congress is slow. Congress wants to delegate its expertise to people who can wield power more quickly and who have access to better information. It's sort of a defense of more administrative governance. And that was her defense of the Department of Education sort of canceling student loan debt without Congress's authorization, because it's this presumption that they got more, that they have this authority, that we like administrative agencies. At least, of course, Justice Kagan is not totally consistent on that during the Trump administration, but I think that shows one point of view about administrative power, and the majority of the Roberts Court is sort of taking this view that's very rooted also in democratic ideas. Just as Kagan said, the court is subverting the Democratic president here. The majority said the president is subverting the Democratic Congress, and that's the democratically elected Congress, and that's a perfect example of divided power and contestation about what democracy means with different functions for different institutions. But the Roberts Court has been very clear repeatedly, whether it's on environmental regulation, whether it's on COVID restrictions, whether it's on student debt, that it wants Congress to speak clearly. It wants Congress to say what the law should be, because it sees that as the wellspring of democratic politics is Congress. And there's legitimate debate among people. Can the court telling Congress to do things make Congress actually do it? Or are we just going to revert to this separation of parties, like you said, instead of separation of powers, where the president does what he wants if he can get around Congress? And it's a good question, but we won't know if we don't enforce those limits on executive authority and require Congress to do it. But that's I think, the one clear Roberts Court view of how democracy needs to operate. Other decisions involved elections. I think there was a decision on the Voting Rights Act, which basically allowed, Alabama has had basically the same congressional map since 1992. It has one majority black district. A lawsuit asked for it to have two majority black districts, to sort of use a race-conscious way to carve up the state, to change the composition of these districts. And lots of people thought the Roberts Court was going to say, no, you don't get to. Chief Justice Roberts has famously said that it's a sordid business to divide people by race in this way, but the court allowed it in a sort of surprising 5-4 majority, which, by the way, is another. And this, frankly, Reihan, is one of the debates I find most frustrating, because if you don't think that is a good way to draw the districts, you're against voting rights. Even though nobody's right to vote is affected, you're just saying that districts ought to be drawn in a race-neutral way. You shouldn't draw them to dilute any group's power or to amplify it. But the idea that we need to segregate people in order to draw districts, or you oppose voting rights, is a very deeply entrenched idea. And I think, frankly, that the Roberts Court made this calculation that was not going to go over well when you have the president saying Republicans want to implement Jim Crow and stuff to defend an Alabama map against this challenge. So that was another issue.
So you've argued that the Chief Justice has been strategic and in a sense being political in the mix of decisions. Tell us a bit about that. I mean, do you consider that ultimately defensible, given the threats to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, which certainly very contested?
I'm glad I'm not, a judge, because it's a difficult question, I do think it's too simple to say, well, a judge just follows the law, and no matter what the law is, the judge just follows it. Because when you're on the Supreme Court, there's these questions of what cases do you take? What issues do you reach? How much respect do you give to precedent? And these all, frankly, the following the law works 99% of the, it's very important to follow the law and the original meaning of the statutes and so on. But that does not get you, I think, all the way there in certain cases where there's just a prudential decision of, is it necessary for us to take this case now? Okay, well, do we want to overturn precedent? The test for that includes whether the precedent was workable, whether people rely on it, and all sorts of value-laden tests. So I think the Chief Justice can say, look, we're not going to disturb our precedent for now. That's our precedent. I think he's probably correct that the existing court's precedent, which is very kind of alarming for people who think that there should be a colorblind constitution, it's precedent in voting. I mean, people don't know, but this the Jingles test that they've established for deciding these districts is basically like, directly as a compensation for discrimination and bad social conditions. And if you look at the totality of the discrimination faced, you're going to make the districts a certain way. Under that precedent, this is probably the right decision. Do you want to disturb the precedent? These are questions. When is the right time to do so? So I think that is unavoidable. That kind of that you of course don't want to be bullied into making just wrong decisions, but I think there's some prudential politics that's inescapable.
It's not the decision you would have made, but you appreciate some of the sensitivities of building a coalition on the court and kind of making decisions that will command wide assent.
Yeah, I wouldn't have made that. I think that was the wrong decision. I think that it was probably helpful for the court in the short term, if it's also going to ban affirmative action that year, to not be consumed by charges that it's eliminating voting rights of minorities. It's hard to calculate ultimately how they'll play out, and there's conservatives who make a very strong argument, that even by appearing to take these things into account, you invite more of this sort of pressure that undermines the law. But I just think looking at the history of courts in the United States and other countries, there's no escaping that the federal courts in the United States, they do not automatically have get assent, and there's some element of maneuvering that they do in order to make sure that the law is followed. And I will say for the Roberts Court, for all of its howling critics and its place seems pretty secure in the separation of powers. There's nobody who's successfully undermined the court in my view. So I think, made a real threat of defying it, or we'll see what happens. But I think it's defensible for judges to consider the context of their decisions.
It seems that the advent of a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, which is a bit of an oversimplification because, of course, it's not as though the justices vote in lockstep in these, imagined ideological blocks. But, that is certainly the kind of common perception that there's this 6-3, at least for now, insurmountable conservative majority. It really does seem to have energized but also alarmed many legal progressives who are thinking hard about structural reform of the Supreme Court, other ways that they can basically do some kind of end run around this, what they see as a big obstacle to achieving a lot of their most important political and legal and policy objectives. So I wonder, where do you think legal progressives go next? Is there going to be a renewed push for court packing? Is there going to be renewed interest in, for example, stripping federal court jurisdiction over certain policy issues? What do you see as the most promising avenues for folks on the legal left who want to circumscribe the power of the Supreme Court?
It's a great question. I will say they look to me to be in a weaker position at the end of this term because the Supreme Court's decision, its big June decision on affirmative action, is popular, and the legal left, which is concentrated into sort of certain parts of American society geographically and institutionally, is attacking them for it, and so I don't think they're on such sound footing right now, and we'll see how that, they're going to continue to demand an ethics code and all sorts of things. I mean, that part of the point of the ethics code is to try to play games with recusal. I think packing, has been the main threat, and it only requires a bare majority in the Congress. But I do think we would see a big backlash to that if that tried to go into effect. Swing
state Democrats are going to be very reluctant to take that step, is what you're saying.
I think so, and I think I think so. I mean, for now, I think frankly the biggest risk is defiance, and the biggest risk is that decisions are not followed and can become dead letter. Because I mean, one thing the Warren Court had going for it, the liberal majority court for decades that was making big changes in American life, was the American elite and powerful institutions really supported that and supported the projects of the Warren Court. You now have a conservative majority on the court where it's a very hostile American elite, and for example, institutions like Harvard forcing them to comply with this ruling on affirmative action is not trivial. If you have lower court judges who want to hold up litigation and declare that Harvard is in compliance when it's really not, these things will take a long time. So I'd say there's a big risk in the long run, or I don't know if there's a big risk. I think, like I said, I think the court's position is secure in part because other branches and sources of authority are pretty weak in our constitutional scheme. I think subversion and ignoring the ruling. I mean, you have Biden now trying to do the student debt cancellation by other means, but he would presumably abide by another court ruling on that. But that's what I look at. Is it enforceable? Will people say they're complying with rulings, but really not do so? Use bureaucratic methods and sort of the accumulated power that liberalism has in American institutions to ignore rulings.
Just looking at the international context for a moment, you wrote a brilliant column in March about Israel. At the time, a right-of-center coalition government led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was pushing for a sweeping reform that would have circumscribed judicial review in Israel, which in recent decades has become essentially unbounded. This was followed by massive street protests that continue to reverberate in Israeli life today. I wonder, what is your assessment of the political situation in Israel right now? And are there any lessons Americans might take away? In that column, you made this really, really insightful observation that there was a sense in which the kind of cultural conflict in Israel was an inversion of the cultural conflict in America. I wonder if you could tell us more about that. Gordon.
Yeah, I think, like I was saying, how the the Warren Court in the United States had sort of the support of the elite institutions. Israel's Supreme Court, Israel has different social divisions, Ashkenazi, secular, religious are different. But I think the fundamental, similarly, its court is like a real liberal power center. And even as the governments are increasingly Likud-led governments in Israel, the labor Zionism, the more progressive Zionism of Israel's earlier decades is losing its political base. The court is like the main thing that liberal Israelis hold on to, but the difference is secular Israelis fear that they're becoming a minority in Israel, and they are in fact becoming a minority. Israel is becoming more religious. The United States is becoming more secular, and it's Christians especially and religious people who fear that they're becoming a minority. And when you're a minority, you tend to turn to the courts for protection. They are a counter-majoritarian institution. So if you can't win at the ballot box, the court will still protect your values from the majority often. And so in Israel, we have sort of the opposite tendency as in the United States, where the court is something that liberal Israelis reach to for protection. And the United States, it's conservative and traditional people are more likely to see the court as friendly to them. We saw that in the ruling on forced speech and 303 Creative, which had to do with making a wedding website for same-sex weddings. So you kind of have these inverted systems, but you have a huge fight in both instances, and it often leads people to be totally hypocritical. You have President Biden attacking and Democrats attacking the United States Supreme Court as counter-majoritarian and the rest of it, while they're also declaring that the opposite in Israel, so that just shows how much of this is outcome driven and not process driven.
I want to quote a column of yours from not long ago. The pattern of close elections in the 21st century, not just 2020, but also 2016, 2004, and 2000, is that they are doubted and delegitimized by the losing side. At the same time, the Democratic Party and liberal intellectuals have launched a political assault on the Supreme Court and judicial review itself as undemocratic and legitimate. Looking at the larger historical context, looking at interwar Europe, looking at Argentina under Juan Perón, it really does seem as though you've had some more or less liberal democratic regimes that have slid into authoritarianism. When you look at the state of discourse about democracy in America today, are you concerned that we are heading in that direction of this kind of mutual demonization that makes it very, very hard to shore up the legitimacy of core constitutional institutions? Or do you believe that we are going to recover?
I think ultimately we're going to recover probably because the United States is so big and has such depth of so much room to experiment, and sort of this liberal system has amazing capacity for recovering and correcting. I will say, to your quote, I mean, my biggest fear of a constitutional crisis is not somebody like Trump loses an election and tries to say that he won when he has no chance really of actually pulling that off because everyone in power can see that he lost and won't accept it. My concern is more something like Bush versus Gore, where the Supreme Court, we've made the Supreme Court the final arbiter of our elections. That's another piece of its rulings this year on the independent state legislature doctrine. It basically said, look, we're going to decide whether state election rules are kosher or not. I can imagine a situation where an election outcome is contested. Liberals have delegitimized the Supreme Court to the extent that when it goes to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court, follows the law and says something like, look, similar like it said in Florida, no, there's no recount or these ballots that came in late, you don't get to count them, something like that, that would lead to just, real violence and instability. I don't really see the capacity for, and at that point things get unpredictable.
Does the Electoral Count Act give you some hope that there might be a bipartisan coalition to step back from the brink and try to shore up some of these core institutions?
As with all these things, the Electoral Count Act was a response to one thing. It was a response to the January 6th riot and the way Trump tried to overturn the election. But the way that it tried to do that was it tried to give a fast track of appeal to the Supreme Court and reduce Congress's power to overturn the election. And like we said, it's like a total obsession of some Democrats to attack the court with conspiracies and the rest of it and make people think that it's a sinister and undemocratic body. So I think that the solution worked to prevent the Trump scenario. It doesn't necessarily work to prevent the next scenario, which could look very different. Because frankly, there's no way to do that. I mean, and that's sort of another thing that I think, like this idea that if we just had the right institutions and rules, then we could safeguard our elections. Sure, but our rules were frankly pretty good before the Electoral Count Act. They're pretty good. If people don't want to follow them or people don't trust the institutions that are adjudicating them, the rules are not going to get you that far. And that's where this mutual demonization comes in, because in a situation where there's a disputed election, everyone is going to think that they're saving democracy, and that is the animating principle for both parties, and that's just going to make them fight even harder.
Jason, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Reihan.
Listeners, don't forget to check out his work for the Manhattan Institute. We'll link to a Scholar page in the podcast description. If you like what you heard on the podcast, please feel free to write a review wherever you listen, and be sure to tune in to future episodes of Manhattan Insights. I'm your host, Reihan Salam.